A newborn baby girl, naked and shivering, was abandoned in a styrofoam box deep in the woods by her own mother's brother-in-law. She didn't scream, she didn't cry. She just breathed, barely, until a 67-year-old widow, stirred by an unexplainable feeling, wandered into the rain-soaked forest and heard a faint whimper, like a quiet plea. "Please, don't die." The flag came folded into a tight triangle, edges sharp, pressed like grief. Clara Jensen held it with both hands, fingers white at the knuckles, as if the weight of it might slip through her palms and vanish forever. Benjamin had been gone for 71 days. She still counted. Outside the church, the autumn wind blew low across the gravestones, and the sky, grey and swollen, seemed to hold its breath. Mourners lingered under umbrellas, shuffling in silence. Some whispered condolences, others simply touched her arm, their pity soaking deeper than the rain. Vincent stood behind her, a hand lightly resting on her back. Too steady, too present. He was Benjamin's older brother, wider shoulders, colder voice, same grey eyes that used to light up when they were kids playing football in the backyard. Now his eyes didn't light up. They judged. "You should get some rest," Vincent said quietly as they walked to the car. Clara looked straight ahead. "I'll rest when he comes home." He didn't respond. They drove in silence back to the Jensen house, an old colonial wrapped in white siding and vines turning red. Lorna, Benjamin's mother, met them at the door, wiping her hands on a dish towel, her face drawn tight as piano wire. "I've set a room for you upstairs," she said to Clara. "You shouldn't be alone right now." Clara nodded, grateful but hollow. Upstairs, in the guest room that still smelled faintly of cedar and lavender, Clara unpacked nothing. Her suitcase sat unopened by the dresser for 3 days. Instead, she spent her nights sitting by the window, listening to the wind press against the glass, imagining it carried Benjamin's voice, or maybe just the memory of it. She hadn't cried yet, not really, not the way people expected widows to cry. She remembered what Benjamin once said after his father died. "Grief is quieter than they tell you, Clara. Sometimes it just sits with you, like a second shadow." Vincent was around more than she needed, bringing tea she didn't ask for, checking if she'd eaten, watching her like he was trying to figure something out she hadn't said aloud. Then one night, she went downstairs for water and saw him standing at the back door, smoking. His silhouette was sharp against the porch light, hand tucked into his pocket. "You're not sleeping," he said, without turning around. She hesitated. "Neither are you." He looked at her then, eyes unreadable. "Ben never told me what he saw over there, in Syria, but I think he carried more than anyone realized." Clara gripped the banister. "He told me everything." Vincent exhaled a slow line of smoke. "No, Clara. He told you what you could handle." There was something cruel in the way he said it, like she hadn't been enough, like she'd failed her own husband by surviving him. That night, Gloria, the next-door neighbor, saw Clara and Vincent sitting too close on the porch bench. Gloria had always been the kind to notice, to remember. "She's still in black, Vincent," Gloria whispered later to Lorna, "and already leaning." Lorna didn't respond, but her lips tightened. By week 3, Clara had stopped attending Sunday service. Too many eyes, too many whispers that never turned into words. Harriet, Lorna's oldest friend, came for tea and left saying, "Grief makes people strange, but some lines ought not be crossed, even in sorrow." One afternoon, Clara found herself folding Benjamin's favorite shirt. It still held the scent of his cologne, sandalwood and old pine. She sat on the bed and clutched it to her chest until her shoulders began to shake. That was the closest she came to crying. That evening, Vincent knocked on her door, holding a photo album. "I thought you'd want these." She took it wordlessly. Inside were pictures from their childhood. Benjamin on a swing set, laughing. Him and Vincent in baseball uniforms. One photo of all three. Clara between them, 19, smiling like she didn't know how many storms love would one day have to outlast. "He always looked at you like you were the safest place on earth," Vincent said. Clara stared at the photo. "Then why does it feel like I'm the place he ran from?" Vincent didn't answer. He only lingered a moment longer than he should have. And when he left, the door closed too slowly, like regret. That night, Clara sat at the window again. She held Benjamin's shirt. She didn't cry. But this time, she whispered, "I'm still here, Ben. I don't know what that means yet, but I'm still here." And outside, the wind answered softly, nothing more than the sound of leaves falling, one by one, like pieces of what was once whole. The night Benjamin died, Clara stopped wearing her wedding ring, not because she stopped being his wife, but because every time the gold caught the light, it made her feel like a liar, like she was pretending he might still walk through the door, boots muddy, arms wide, saying, "I'm home, babe." Like war hadn't changed the map of their lives. But war changes everything. She'd begun spending long evenings on the back porch, where the creaking swing still held the memory of his weight. The wind had cooled with October, but she didn't mind the cold. It helped her feel something, anything, besides the dull, relentless ache in her chest. Vincent brought her a blanket one night. She hadn't asked. He just stood behind her, then draped it over her shoulders. "You're gonna catch something sitting out here." She didn't look up. "I already have." Silence. The kind that holds too many things unsaid. He sat down beside her, not touching, but close. Too close. They rocked gently in the swing, side by side, the chains squealing just slightly. The wind whispered through the trees. "You know," Vincent said after a while, "Ben always said you were the only thing that made the world make sense to him." Clara's eyes closed. "He made the world too loud sometimes, but he always loved me quietly. I miss that." Vincent turned to her. "You deserve more than a ghost." She flinched, not visibly. Just a small breath caught behind her ribs. From the kitchen window, Gloria watched the porch light flicker. Two silhouettes, too still, too long. It hadn't started that night. It started weeks ago. Shared glances at dinner, his hand lingering on her lower back when she passed behind him. She'd pulled away, but not hard enough. Clara didn't love Vincent. That much she knew. But Vincent, he looked at her like someone who wanted to rewrite the past. His own, Ben's, hers. He was always there, in the corner of her grief, listening, waiting. And grief, when it lingers long enough, becomes a kind of hunger. That night, the night, it rained. Hard. The kind of rain that makes the roof sound like it's pleading. Clara stood by the window in the guest room, arms folded. Her nightgown clung to her legs. Downstairs, everyone else had gone to sleep. The world felt folded in, like a letter no one would ever open. Then came the knock. 3 soft taps. She didn't move at first. "Clara?" Vincent's voice low. "You awake?" She opened the door. He stood there, hair damp, holding 2 mugs. "Couldn't sleep. Thought you might want some tea." She hesitated, then stepped back. They didn't talk much, just sipped, looked out the window at the storm, and then, without warning, without pretense, he reached up, brushed a strand of hair from her cheek. She froze. His hand lingered. She didn't pull away. He kissed her, and she kissed him back. Not out of love, not out of desire, but out of exhaustion, of being watched by silence and judged by shadows. Later, when she lay beside him, staring at the ceiling, she whispered, "I hate myself already." Vincent lit a cigarette. "Don't. Ben's dead, and he's not coming back." She sat up. "That doesn't give you the right to speak about him like that." He exhaled slowly. Cold. Controlled. "He's not a saint, Clara. You think he didn't keep secrets? You think you were the only one hurting?" She turned to him. "He never lied to me." Vincent looked at her with a smirk that sliced deep. "He didn't have to. He just never told you the whole truth." She pulled the blanket tighter around herself, her voice shaking. "I think you like standing in his shadow. But you'll never be him." Vincent stubbed the cigarette out on the nightstand. "Maybe not. But at least I'm here. He left you." That was when she got up, walked to the bathroom, turned on the water, let it run scalding. She didn't cry, didn't scream, just stood under the faucet until her skin burned, as if she could wash the night away before it set like a stain. Downstairs, the hallway light flicked on. Lorna had seen Vincent come down from the guest room. She didn't say a word, but her eyes narrowed. And in the corner of the kitchen, Gloria stood with a bag of groceries she'd just dropped off, frozen in place. "I knew it," she murmured. By morning, everything was quiet. Vincent avoided her eyes. Clara packed her suitcase, but she didn't leave. Lorna brought up breakfast, set it down without a word. Clara thanked her, but Lorna didn't reply. Only Harriet, who came later that afternoon, broke the silence. She sat on the edge of Clara's bed, looked her straight in the eye. "I've buried a husband too," she said. "I know what loneliness tastes like. But there's a difference between grief and betrayal. And if you're not careful, child, one will bury the other." Clara didn't answer. She just looked at the framed photo of Benjamin on the nightstand. His smile still didn't know what was coming. That evening, Clara went back to the porch swing. Alone. The wind had changed. It smelled of cold pine and wood smoke. She folded her hands in her lap, and for the first time since the funeral, she cried. Not loud, not broken, but the kind of cry that knows it can't change anything. Just cleanse what's left. It started with a smell. Eggs frying in the kitchen, a whiff of old perfume on a scarf in the closet. Things that once meant home now turned her stomach. Clara brushed it off at first, chalking it up to stress, to grief, to the cruel trick her body was playing on her after everything it had lost. But by the 7th week, the morning nausea came like clockwork. By the 8th, she had to excuse herself during church service to avoid vomiting in the vestibule. And by the 9th, she knew. There was a small clinic outside town, tucked behind a used bookstore, where no one from the Jensen circle would go. She walked in on a Thursday morning with a hoodie pulled low over her forehead and sunglasses hiding her eyes, even though the day was overcast. The test took 3 minutes. The nurse didn't look surprised. "It's early," she said, "but not too early." Clara stared at the ceiling as the nurse listed options, support groups, pamphlets. Her voice floated like a radio in the next room. Present, but impossible to hold on to. That night, Clara lay awake in bed, hands on her belly, feeling nothing, but knowing. And the knowing was enough to unravel something inside her. The clock blinked 2:43 a.m. when she finally whispered out loud, "You weren't supposed to happen." But the words tasted wrong, like blame spoken in a church pew. "I didn't plan you," she thought, "but I'm here now." Weeks passed, the calendar flipped, and Clara's world shrank to the rhythm of fatigue, secrecy, and the small, invisible life growing inside her. No one suspected, not yet. But Vincent watched her differently now, not with guilt, not with curiosity, with calculation. One morning she found him already in the kitchen, drinking coffee in silence. "You've been avoiding me," he said. She sat down slowly. "I've been busy." "With what?" His tone cut sharp. "Staring at the same four walls? Writing letters you never send?" Clara didn't look at him. "I'm pregnant." The words came like the click of a trigger. Vincent didn't blink. He just leaned back, mug still in hand. "So it's true." "I didn't say it was yours." His mouth curled. "It's not Ben's, Clara. He's dead." Her hand tightened on the table. "Don't say it like that." Vincent stood. "So what's your plan? Gonna raise it here? Pretend it was some immaculate conception?" She stood too, her voice rising, firmer than she thought she had left in her. "It's my child. That's the plan." He laughed, low and joyless. "You really think people won't talk? They already are. I don't care what people say. You should." His voice turned cold. "Because when that baby's born, everyone's going to know exactly what kind of woman you are." Clara's eyes burned, but she didn't flinch. Better to be a woman who tells the truth than a man who hides behind someone else's name. He moved closer, too close. "You're making a mistake." "No," she whispered. "I made that mistake with you. This child isn't the mistake. You are." Vincent slammed the mug into the sink and stormed out. The sound echoed long after the door shut. Clara stood alone in the kitchen, hand trembling near her belly. Not for fear, for resolve. That night, she finally wrote a letter to Benjamin. The first since the funeral. She didn't hold back. "You left me in a world that doesn't know how to be kind. And I've made choices I never imagined. But this child, she's yours too somehow. Not by blood, but by the hope you left behind. I'll raise her with the goodness you gave me. I'll make sure she knows she was never born from shame, but from a silence that refused to become a grave." She folded the letter, placed it beneath his old army photo on the nightstand. 2 days later, Lorna entered the room without knocking. Her face was hard, her hands shaking slightly. "Is it true?" she asked. "What Gloria said?" Clara didn't ask what Gloria had said. She simply nodded. Lorna's voice cracked like dry wood. "I thought you loved my son." "I did," Clara replied. "I do." "Then how could you—" "I was broken," she said. So was Vincent. "That's no excuse." "I'm not asking for an excuse," Clara said, standing her ground. "Just understanding." Lorna looked at her for a long, unbearable moment. Then she said, "You'll have to leave." Clara swallowed. "Where will I go?" "That's not my concern." Clara looked toward the window, where the late autumn light fell in slats across the floor. "I'm not running away. Not anymore." "You're not welcome here," Lorna whispered, eyes narrowed. "And neither is that child." Clara nodded quietly. "Then I'll go. But she'll know her story, every part of it, even the parts that hurt." When Lorna left, the silence that followed felt different, not heavier, cleaner. Clara packed slowly that night, a small suitcase, a worn sweater of Benjamin's, and the little white onesie she'd once hidden in the back of the closet, bought when they thought they might try for a child after the next deployment. The next morning, before sunrise, Clara walked through the backyard, the frost still fresh on the grass. She stopped at the porch swing where Benjamin used to sit, boots muddy, letters half written in his lap. She sat down, hand resting on the swell barely visible beneath her coat. The wind was sharp but clean, the kind that made you feel new, not empty. She closed her eyes and said aloud, quietly, "From here on, we build our own kind of truth." And from somewhere far off, she thought she heard the wind reply, soft as memory, sure as morning. The cottage sat at the far edge of Green Valley, cloaked in pine and mist, as though the world itself had turned its back and granted Clara the silence she begged for. The house belonged to Margaret Whittaker, a retired nurse in her 70s who had once nursed Benjamin through a childhood fever. Clara remembered the name from old stories, never expected the woman to still be alive, let alone open her door without a single question. "You're not the first girl to show up with a secret," Margaret had said, her eyes soft, but not pitying. "Come in before the frost bites." And so began 9 months of hiding. Clara lived like a ghost, and for a while that suited her. She spent mornings in the garden tending brittle soil, afternoons folding laundry that wasn't hers, and evenings writing long, trembling letters to a child that hadn't yet opened her eyes. She kept them tucked in an old biscuit tin beneath the floorboard, each sealed with the same line: "I don't know who I'll be when you arrive, but I promise I'll be waiting." She rarely left the cottage. Margaret, who'd never married or had children of her own, took on the role of silent guardian. She fetched groceries, arranged the rare prenatal appointments in towns far enough away to avoid recognition. And when Clara woke, gasping from dreams of Benjamin, she brewed tea and never once asked what he'd said in them. But every so often, in the hush between footsteps, Clara felt the past slinking closer. And it wasn't her imagination. In town, Gloria Weston still had her ways. Through church circles and bridge nights, she gathered whispers the way others collected recipes. One call to Margaret, just to check in, was all it took to confirm the rumor that Clara was still alive, and not alone. Vincent learned the rest in silence. He didn't storm, he didn't shout. He simply sat in his truck for hours, staring out across the Jensen land, the wind rustling through the cornfields, and thought about legacies. Benjamin's legacy. Harold Jensen's will had never mattered until now. It had always been a sentimental clause. The firstborn of Benjamin, if ever one came, would receive the Jensen trust, land, and voting rights in the family business. A formality, a ghost clause. No one ever believed it would surface. But now there was a baby that could undo everything. Vincent knew Gloria would call again. She always did. And when she did, he'd be ready. On the first week of March, Clara began feeling the shifting. Isla, she'd already named her, moved differently now, slower, heavier, more certain. Clara would lie in the armchair by the fire, hand on her belly, whispering stories about Benjamin, about stars, about silence, the kind of silence that protects, not punishes. "I'll tell you the truth one day," she whispered once. "But for now, just grow. Just breathe." The labor came early, 2 weeks too soon, on the kind of night when the sky felt like it was coming apart. Trees bent, shutters rattled, and the wind screamed through the valley like it had unfinished business. Margaret boiled towels, called an old friend, a midwife named Agnes, who arrived near midnight, soaked and swearing. Clara screamed once, and then again. But at 2:12 a.m., Isla entered the world. Tiny, red, wailing, alive. "She's got lungs," Agnes said with a grin. Clara wept quietly. "She looks like him. She really does." Margaret wrapped the baby in a soft grey blanket and laid her against Clara's chest. "You did good," she said. Clara looked down at the infant, blinking, wriggling. "Isla," she whispered. "Like an island. The kind you don't see until you've been lost long enough." They fell asleep like that, mother and child, breath to breath. The storm passed overhead, rumbling low like a retreating animal. Agnes left just before sunrise, promising to return with supplies. The cottage grew quiet again. Too quiet. Vincent arrived just after dawn, his boots crunching frost, face unreadable. He carried a leather folder, freshly notarized papers tucked inside. Margaret opened the door with her hair still wet, a robe clutched around her. "What are you doing here?" she asked. "I'm here for Clara," he said smoothly. "She called me." "No, she didn't. She's not well. She's confused. Told me she doesn't want the baby. Said it was best to start over." Margaret frowned. She would never say that. He pulled the folder from under his coat. "Legal documents. Signed, let me wake her. She's resting. Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Margaret." She hesitated. Something in his voice. It wasn't threatening. It was worse. It was final. Margaret stepped back. Vincent walked in. Isla was swaddled in the cradle by the fire. Her breath was soft, her eyelids fluttering. He didn't look at her, just picked her up, like a bag of groceries. He left a note on the mantel. By the time Clara woke, the crib was empty. She staggered to her feet, calling Isla's name, voice hoarse. Then she saw the note. "You'll thank me one day. I did what was right, for all of us." "V," she screamed. Margaret burst in, face drained of blood. "He said you called him, said you were done. Clara, I didn't know." But Clara had already dropped to her knees. She didn't weep. Not yet. That came later. At 6:04 a.m., a hiker named Grace, early riser, retired nurse, walked a trail near Echo Ridge. Something caught her eye near the brush line, a white styrofoam box, moving. She rushed over. Inside, wrapped in a towel, lips trembling, fingers curled, was a baby girl. She was alive. Grace would later tell the EMTs she was trying to cry, but she was just too cold. She named her Mira, short for miracle. But her mother, miles away, was still kneeling on the hardwood floor of a borrowed home, holding a blanket that no longer smelled like her child. The storm had not let up for hours. It lashed against rooftops, gnawed at the trees, and poured over the narrow roads like grief that couldn't be held back any longer. Most people stayed in. Grace Holloway, however, was not most people. At 67, Grace knew storms intimately. Not just the kind that battered wood and glass, but the kind that came silently, wrecking the inside of a person. That morning, something had stirred her from bed before daylight, and though her knees ached and the cold clung to her bones, she laced up her boots and drove toward Echo Ridge Trail. Her late husband used to say, "The air up there cleared the mind." He was right, though he hadn't lived long enough to walk it beside her in old age. Grace pulled her truck off the gravel path and stepped out into the downpour, clutching her coat tighter. The trail was slippery, the pine needles slick beneath her boots, but her pace was steady, led by a feeling she couldn't name. Something sharp, something urgent. She was a mile in when she heard it. A cry, not a fox, not a bird. Something higher, frailer. A sound that cracked through the storm like a glass breaking on tile. Grace stopped cold. She tilted her head, heart pounding, and listened. The rain muffled everything, but there it was again, a thin, gasping wail. She moved toward it, leaving the path, her boots splashing into soaked earth. Brambles scratched at her legs. Her breath grew sharp with effort, but she kept going, part instinct, part prayer. Then she saw it. Half hidden behind a fallen log and a cluster of brush sat a small white box, styrofoam, the kind you find in cheap diners or corner stores. It was soaked, stained, and shifting. Grace dropped to her knees, mud seeping into her jeans. With trembling hands, she lifted the lid, and the world narrowed. Inside lay a newborn, wrapped in a towel so thin it was nearly transparent. Her skin was icy, lips tinged a faint blue, but her chest rose and fell. She whimpered, barely. Grace's hands fluttered for a moment, suspended in shock. Then they moved, slow, certain, maternal in a way she thought she'd lost decades ago. She lifted the baby to her chest, tucking her into the warmth beneath her coat. The child's body was impossibly small, fragile, and still trying to cry. "Oh my God," Grace whispered, her throat tightening. "Who could have—" But she didn't finish. The question hung unanswered. It would hang there for days. She rose to her feet, careful not to jostle the child, and made her way back to the truck. Breath fast, eyes wide, heart thudding with the awful knowing that she might have been a minute too late. Inside the truck, she cranked the heat, unwrapped an old scarf from the passenger seat, and swaddled the baby tighter. Then she dialed 911. The dispatcher's voice came quick. 911, what's your emergency?" I found a baby," Grace said, voice shaking. "Left in the woods. She's alive, but barely." "Ma'am, stay on the line. Where are you?" "Echo Ridge Trail, just past the first bend." "Please hurry, she's freezing." "Help is on the way." Grace looked down at the infant. The baby's eyes fluttered, unfocused. A tiny fist curled weakly against her coat. "You're all right now," Grace whispered. "You hold on. I've got you." The ambulance pulled up 10 minutes later, tires screeching on wet gravel. Paramedics rushed to the truck. One of them, a younger woman, gently lifted the baby from Grace's arms. "She's cold but breathing," she said, checking vitals. "We've got a chance." Grace stood back, arms empty, heart full of something she couldn't name. "Any idea who left her?" another medic asked. Grace shook her head. There was nothing. No note. Just her. "She'll need a name for intake," the woman said gently. Grace hesitated, then said, "Mira." "Mira? Short for miracle." The medic paused, then nodded. "I think that fits." At the hospital, doctors confirmed what Grace had feared. The baby had been exposed to the cold for hours. Any longer, and her tiny body wouldn't have lasted. But she was strong, resilient. Mira, they called her. The nurses added Holloway at the end for paperwork, even though Grace wasn't family. Yet. Grace stayed late into the night, sitting quietly in the waiting room, still wearing the damp coat, eyes fixed on the small glass window that separated her from the neonatal ward. Mira lay inside, tubes running to her nose, arms curled under the blanket, chest rising slow but steady. A nurse brought her coffee. Grace didn't drink it. She was too busy watching the child breathe. 2 days passed. No parents came forward. No missing baby report. The police asked questions. Grace answered what she could. The rest was silence. On the 3rd day, a social worker approached her. A kind-eyed man named Russell. "You're listed as the emergency contact," he said. "I didn't know who else would be," she replied. He nodded. "We'll find a place for her soon, unless you'd like to foster temporarily." Grace's hands folded in her lap. "I haven't raised a baby in decades." Russell smiled. She won't care. Grace looked toward the nursery again, then back at him. "I'll take her home." That night, the storm finally passed. The air smelled of pine and promise. Grace stood in the doorway of her house, Mira bundled in her arms, watching the stars peek out between the clouds. The house felt different, alive again. She placed Mira in a crib long forgotten in her attic, her daughter's, then her granddaughter's. She pulled up a rocking chair beside it and sat in the dark, listening to the baby's breath, and then she spoke. "I lost one of my own, a long time ago. No one ever saw her. No one held her but me." She looked down at the bundle. "But I see you, I hear you, and I won't let go." In the quiet that followed, Mira stirred and smiled, just slightly, but it was enough. The morning light poured into the kitchen like a promise too bright for the grief that still clung to the corners of Clara's ribs. She hadn't opened the curtains in weeks. But Margaret had, quietly, gently, like someone trying to coax a stray animal back into warmth. On the table sat a chipped ceramic mug. Clara's hands wrapped around it absently, though she hadn't taken a sip. The tea had long gone cold. 9 days. That's how long it had been since Isla was taken. Clara had said the name aloud only once since, and even then, it had felt like a betrayal, like calling for someone who had already started forgetting the sound of her voice. Margaret was at the sink, rinsing dishes without speaking. She knew better than to push. The old house breathed around them, floorboards creaking, wind brushing against the windows, silence stretching across the space like a third presence. Then came the knock, sharp, 2 beats. Then another. Clara startled, nearly dropping the mug. Margaret dried her hands quickly and moved to the door. It was Dorothy Lane, their nearest neighbor. Nearly 80, fiercely independent, and one of the few people Margaret tolerated more than 15 minutes at a time. "Morning," Dorothy said, holding out a folded newspaper. "Thought you might want to see this." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "You walked all the way out here for a headline?" Dorothy hesitated. Number for her. She glanced toward Clara, then back again. "Page 4, bottom corner." Margaret took the paper and nodded. "You want coffee?" "I'll sit a minute," Dorothy said, "but only if it's strong." Inside, Clara had barely moved. Her eyes were fixed on the steamless tea, as if willing it to return to warmth. Margaret slid into the chair across from her, opening the paper slowly, carefully, smoothing the fold like a secret too fragile to be handled rough. And then she saw it. A small photo, blurry but unmistakable. A baby, wrapped in a hospital blanket, eyes barely open. The headline read, "Miracle Baby, found in styrofoam box, survives, freezing night." Below, in smaller font, "Local woman discovers infant left in woods during storm. Community rallies around child, now known as Mira." Margaret didn't speak right away. She just slid the paper across the table. Clara blinked, looked down, then froze. Her fingers trembled as they traced the photo, the name blurred in her vision, but the shape of the baby's brow. She knew it. Isla. Her Isla. But they'd renamed her. Mira. She let out a sound, not quite a sob, not quite a gasp, more like breath being broken open from the inside. "That's her," she whispered. "That's my daughter." Dorothy looked up from her coffee. "I thought it might be." Margaret reached for Clara's hand. "She's alive." Clara nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "They called her a miracle. That's what I wrote in the letter. The one I kept in the tin box. I called her that before she was born, before she even had a face." Dorothy stood slowly. "I should go. Didn't mean to intrude." "You didn't," Clara said, voice hoarse. "You brought her back to me." Margaret folded the paper, gently, as if it were sacred. "We'll figure this out. Carefully." Clara's voice was quiet but firm. "I want to see her." Across town, Grace Holloway was spooning mashed bananas into a small bowl. Mira lay in a bassinet by the window, tiny hands flailing softly, her lips making bubbles as she cooed at the drifting curtain. The room smelled of lavender and oatmeal. Grace hummed as she mashed, an old hymn, half forgotten but warm in her throat. Mira had been home 5 days. They'd given her formula at the hospital, but Grace had started cooking again. Apples, pears, mashed vegetables, soft foods for soft beginnings. The article had gone out that morning. A reporter from the local station had interviewed her on the porch 2 days prior, asking about the moment she'd found the baby. She hadn't wanted to talk at first, but then he'd asked what she hoped for the child, and she'd said that she never doubts she was wanted. Now, watching Mira stare up at the sun-washed ceiling, Grace whispered, "You're part of this world now, baby girl, and someone out there might be missing you something fierce." Mira blinked. Grace kissed her fingers. "We'll wait and see." That evening, Clara stood in the guest bedroom, the biscuit tin in her hands. Inside were the letters. One for each week she'd carried Isla, 40 in total. She opened the one marked Week 14. "You've started to kick. I pretend it's just gas when people ask, but I know it's you. Me little swimmer. I already love you more than I'm ready for." Then, Week 26. "Some nights I dream of you walking barefoot through the orchard. I know you'll never remember it, but I will. Every branch, every blossom." Then, Week 40. "If you don't come soon, I'll start believing you're waiting for spring. You're stubborn, like your father. I hope you carry his strength, but not his silence." Clara folded the letter back with shaking hands, then turned to Margaret. "I need to go." Margaret nodded. "Not just to look," Clara continued. "I need to speak, to be seen. I can't let them tell her story without me." Margaret stepped forward. "Then let's tell it right." Later that night, the storm returned. Soft at first, then louder, like a memory knocking at the roof. But Clara didn't close the curtains this time. She stood by the window, watching the trees sway, and whispered her daughter's name into the glass. Not Mira, but Isla, because even miracles deserve to know where they came from. The invitation came in an off-white envelope, smudged with fingerprints and the scent of wood smoke. On the front, in neat formal lettering, it read, "In gratitude for your prayers during this difficult time, join us in remembering Adam's life." It had been nearly a year since Adam's death. A memorial dinner, Lorraine called it. Something small, just family, something gentle, she'd said over the phone. Clara stared at the envelope long after the call ended, her thumb tracing the edge as if the paper itself could offer clarity. But there was no map for what came next. Only shadows and silence, and a daughter no one knew existed but her. Margaret didn't press, but that morning she left a dress ironed on Clara's bed, and a note. "You don't have to say anything, but it's time they see your face again." The Holloway farmhouse hadn't changed. The porch still sagged at the corner. The wind chime still caught in the same breeze. Clara hadn't stepped foot inside since the funeral. She arrived with her shoulders squared, her grief braided into the strands of her hair, her silence sharp as ever. The house buzzed with polite voices, muffled laughter, casserole dishes clicking against the countertop. Lorraine greeted her first, tight smile, damp eyes. She looked thinner than Clara remembered, paler too. "Thank you for coming," she said softly. Clara nodded. It felt overdue. Emmett stood at the end of the hall, back to them, speaking with a few of the cousins. His voice had that familiar mix of charm and rehearsed humility, like a pastor who'd practiced his eulogy too many times. Clara's stomach turned. She made her way to the dining room. Photos of Adam were propped along the mantel. One in uniform, one holding a fishing rod. One of the three of them, Adam, Emmett, and Lorraine, standing on the porch steps, arms looped like a storybook family. The irony bit hard. Dinner was served. People took their seats. Clara sat at the far end of the table, across from the framed photograph of Adam in his army dress blues. It watched over them like a ghost who knew too much. The first 20 minutes passed in gentle conversation. Lorraine said grace. They shared memories. Someone cried softly. It was almost peaceful, until Emmett lifted his glass. "To Adam," he said, voice smooth. "To his strength, his loyalty, and the love he left behind." A few heads nodded. Some whispered, "Amen." But Clara felt her hand tighten around the edge of her plate. "Family," is the thing that holds when everything else breaks, Emmett continued. Adam knew that. He lived it. Clara looked up, met his gaze across the table. His eyes didn't flinch, but his jaw did. Some families hold lies, she said quietly. The room stilled. A fork clinked against a plate, and no one moved. I'm sorry? Emmett asked, voice a half laugh. Clara folded her hands in her lap. You speak so well of him, but he's not the one who's been lying. Lorraine stiffened. A glass nearly tipped near the center of the table. Clara, Margaret said, her voice a warning under her breath. But Clara kept her eyes on Emmett. Do you remember that night, when the power went out? After the funeral, when everyone else had gone home? He blinked. Just once. I'm not sure what you're talking about. Of course not. Convenient memory. Maybe we should step outside, Lorraine offered, panic starting to edge her tone. No, Clara said softly. Let them hear it. Someone coughed. Another cousin whispered something to her husband. You hurt him, Clara said. You slept with his wife. And when she got pregnant, you convinced her to hide it, then to abandon the child. Emmett laughed. Too loud, too sharp. This is insane. Clara's voice didn't rise. It never needed to. Is it? You lost your baby, Clara, he said, feigning sympathy. We all saw how it broke you. But inventing this fantasy. I didn't lose her, she whispered. You made sure I did. Then came the silence that no casserole or photograph could fill. Lorraine stood abruptly, nearly knocking her chair back. Excuse me, she said, voice shaking, and left the room. Clara stood too, her breathing uneven, her hands trembling. She didn't wait for permission. She walked down the hall and out the back door into the cold night. She didn't cry. Not yet. It wasn't until she reached the old woodshed near the barn, Adam's place of retreat, that she let herself fall to the ground. Leaves clung to her dress. Her breath came in gasps. Behind her, footsteps crunched. I didn't know, a voice said. Clara turned. It was Mabel, Adam's cousin, the one who'd lived on the next property line her whole life. I didn't know what you meant, but I did see something, Mabel said. Back then, that spring after Adam's death. Clara looked up, barely able to speak. I saw Emmett and Lorraine, Mabel whispered. Near the orchard. She looked sick. He looked angry. I didn't tell anyone. It didn't feel like my place. Clara's voice was hoarse. What did you see? Mabel knelt beside her. He said something like, if you can't do it, I will. And she cried. I thought they were just grieving, but now I think they were planning something. I think they'd already decided. Clara felt her throat tighten. The night air pressed in. Mabel laid a hand on her shoulder. If you want to go to the police, I'll speak. The truth lay between them now, breathing. Clara closed her eyes and whispered, Thank you. Not for the evidence, but for the fact that someone had finally said what she'd known all along. She opened her eyes, looked at the stars. One of them flickered, briefly, before settling into steady light. The courthouse was a cold, square building made of brick and old regrets. Its halls echoed with footsteps that carried too much weight, and its windows let in a kind of light that made truth feel sharper, more visible. Clara sat in the waiting room just outside the juvenile courtroom, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She hadn't slept much the night before, not because she was afraid of what would happen, but because she wasn't sure what she would feel if it did. Margaret sat beside her, calm as ever. She'd brought tea in a travel mug and offered it without a word. Clara had accepted, not for the tea, but for the quiet gesture of it. Across the room, a woman in a pale blue blouse and pearl earrings bounced a toddler on her hip. The child giggled, reaching for a paper cup of water. Clara watched, unmoving. Somewhere, behind those thick courtroom doors, her own child was waiting. A child with a different name, a different voice, a different story. Mira's case is first, a clerk called gently. Clara stood. Her legs shook, but not from fear. More from the weight of time. A year's worth of silence pressing against a mother's ribs. Inside the courtroom, the bench sat high. The judge, a woman in her 60s with silver hair and a face carved from patience, adjusted her glasses and looked down at the file. Ms. Holloway, you've been the temporary guardian for one Miss Mira Holloway, correct? Grace stood at the other end of the room, a soft shawl wrapped around her shoulders. She nodded. Yes, Your Honor. And today, we're here to determine long-term placement? Yes, ma'am. The judge's eyes flicked to Clara. And you are? Clara stepped forward. Her mother. There was a pause. Grace turned, eyes wide. The social worker whispered something into her ear. Clara took a breath. I can prove it. There are letters, records, and witnesses. The judge looked over her glasses. We'll need documentation, of course. It's being processed, Margaret said quickly. But we're not here just for a claim. We're here because that child was taken from her mother under false pretenses and left for dead. A murmur swept the small courtroom. Grace took a step closer. Is it true? She asked, her voice breaking. You're her mother? Clara turned toward her. Their eyes met. No resentment, no jealousy. Just two women who had held the same child and loved her in different ways. I never meant for her to end up in a box, Clara said. But I was told I didn't have a choice. That if I kept her, everyone would lose. The judge tapped her pen. This isn't about punishment. It's about the child's welfare. She's safe, Grace said. Healthy. Happy. Clara nodded. Because of you. There was a silence then. Not courtroom silence, but the kind that hangs in the air when something sacred passes between people. Grace looked down. Then she spoke. I didn't know she had a name before we gave her one. She did, Clara said. I called her Isla. The judge looked up. Do you want her back? Clara's lips parted. The question should have had one answer. But now, I want what's best for her, she said. But I want to know her. I want her to know who she came from, that she wasn't abandoned because she wasn't wanted, that she was loved. Every second Grace's eyes welled. Then let's make space for both kinds of love. The judge leaned back. I will need legal documentation before ruling on any custody modification. But in the meantime, I'm going to order supervised visitations, twice weekly. Clara nodded. Thank you. The gavel fell with a soft thud, not final, but promising. That afternoon, Clara waited in the social worker's office. The room was warm, with colored drawings on the wall and a basket of small toys in the corner. When the door opened, her breath caught. There she was, smaller than she'd imagined, lighter hair, big eyes, Adam's eyes, a little hesitant, holding Grace's hand. Clara stood slowly. Hi, she said. Mira tilted her head, then pointed at the silver locket around Clara's neck. Shiny, she whispered. Clara smiled, crouching low. Would you like to see it? The little girl nodded. Clara opened the locket. Inside was a photo of a baby's sonogram. Next to it, a tiny pressed daisy. I carried you, Clara said softly. Right under my heart. Mira didn't speak. She just touched the daisy with one small finger. Then, without a word, she sat beside Clara. Just like that. Grace sat quietly by the door, watching. I never knew love could survive in two places, she said later, tears in her voice. But maybe That's how it grows. The weeks passed gently. At first, Mira stayed quiet during visits. She played with her blocks, hugged her plush rabbit, listened to Clara's stories with polite interest, but she didn't speak much. Then one day, as Clara brushed her tiny curls from her forehead, Mira looked up and said, "You smell like flowers." Clara blinked. "That's lavender. It's always been your favorite." The child didn't ask how she knew. She just smiled, the way children do when something finally makes sense. Months later, the adoption hearing was held again, but this time, not to remove a child from one home to place her in another. This time, it was to recognize both homes. Clara sat beside Grace. Mira sat between them, swinging her feet. The judge smiled. "I believe we've found not one mother, but two." The gavel struck. Outside the courthouse, spring had returned. Clara lifted Mira into her arms. The child giggled, reaching for a blossom falling from a nearby tree. "I want both," she said, looking from one woman to the other. "You have both," Clara whispered, "and always will." Grace rested her hand on Clara's shoulder. From two storms, one child had been saved, and now, so had two mothers. The sign out front was simple, almost too modest for what it meant. The Mira Center, a place for new beginnings. Painted in weathered blue letters, it stood on a quiet lot just past the edge of town, where the fields opened up and the air smelled like soil and promise. Clara stood there now, keys trembling in her hand. Grace joined her at the steps, Mira asleep in her arms, her breath warm against Grace's collarbone. "Ready?" she asked gently. Clara didn't answer right away. She was staring at the front door, painted yellow now. Not bright, just soft, like sun through curtain lace. She had painted it herself. Each brushstroke had been a kind of prayer. Inside, it smelled of cedarwood and new paint. There were no photos on the walls yet, but there would be. One day. They stepped into the main room, sunlight filtering through wide windows. The floor was hardwood, rescued from a demolished schoolhouse in the next county. It creaked with memory. They walked past the reading room, where a rocking chair waited beside a bookshelf already half filled with donated paperbacks. In the far corner stood a small table with 3 tiny chairs, a promise that children would always have a place here. Mira stirred in Grace's arms. Clara reached out and tucked a curl behind her ear. "This place is for her," she said softly. "But it's also for all the mothers who never got to hold their babies, and for the babies who were told they didn't matter." Grace blinked away tears. "We should make it strong, safe, unshakable." Clara looked around. "That means telling the whole story." They knew the press would come. The local paper already had questions. The whispers had spread quickly after the court decision. Some people looked at Clara with pity, some with blame, but others offered quiet nods in the grocery line, casseroles on front steps, and folded notes that read, "Thank you for speaking." In the weeks that followed, they hosted small circles of women, grandmothers, foster mothers, women who had buried grief deep under years of silence. Some came for the tea, others came to talk. On a windy Thursday afternoon, Lorraine came. She sat at the edge of the circle, her hands clenched in her lap. Her face was thinner, eyes ringed with regret. Clara saw her through the window before she entered and felt something she hadn't expected. Not anger, not even sadness, just a kind of tired understanding. The room fell quiet as Lorraine took her seat. "I shouldn't be here," Lorraine said. "I don't deserve it." Margaret, firm, clear-eyed Margaret, spoke first. "Maybe, but this isn't about deserving. It's about truth." Lorraine looked at Clara. "I told myself I was protecting everyone. I was wrong. I let fear make me cruel." Clara didn't reply right away. Then she said, "You didn't throw her in that box, but you let him." Lorraine nodded. Her voice shook. "I was scared of him, of what he knew about me, about the affair, about the lies. He said if I didn't help him cover it, he'd destroy everything." A long silence. Then Grace asked softly, "And what would that have been?" Lorraine looked up. "He kept the will. Adam had changed it, left the house to Clara, not to me. But Emmett found the old one, said if I wanted to keep anything, I had to play along." Margaret cursed under her breath. Clara closed her eyes. "The law will catch up with him," Grace said. "But what do you want from us?" Lorraine hesitated. "I don't want redemption. I just want to help here. Clean bathrooms, cook, something real." Clara stood, walked over. She looked Lorraine in the eyes and said, not kindly, but with finality, "You help by never lying again. Not to yourself, not to another woman in pain." Lorraine nodded. Grace handed her a mop. Spring settled in. The Mirror Center began to bloom. More volunteers arrived. Local teachers offered tutoring hours. A retired judge donated books on advocacy. One woman brought handmade quilts, each one sewn with a child's name. And then, one day, a girl arrived. She was maybe 17. Quiet. Hair tucked under a hoodie. She didn't give her name at first, just stood in the doorway while rain spattered the sidewalk. Clara approached. "You hungry?" The girl nodded. Over soup she spoke in small bits. "Foster home. Bad one. Left last week. Slept in a park." Clara listened. No interruption. No judgment. When the girl finished, Clara only said, "You're safe now. You don't have to tell the whole story today." The girl asked after a while, "Did someone save you too?" Clara smiled. Her eyes flicked towards the room where Mira was coloring beside Grace. "Yes," she said, "but it wasn't just one person. It was a chain of them. People who didn't give up, even when they had every reason to." The girl nodded, as if filing the words away for later. Clara handed her a blanket. "Let's start there." Later that night, Clara sat alone in the reading room. Mira had fallen asleep hours ago, curled against Grace's chest. Lorraine walked in, carrying a basket of folded towels. "She smiled at me today," Lorraine said softly. "Mira, just for a second." Clara looked up. "She sees more than we think. Do you ever wonder what would have happened if he hadn't?" "If I hadn't?" Clara interrupted. "Every day. But I can't live there." Lorraine nodded. "Me neither." They sat in silence for a long while. Then Clara said, "He didn't win, you know. Emmett. He tried to write over her story, but she's still here, laughing, growing. Because of you." "No," Clara whispered. "Because of all of us, even the broken parts." The next morning, a new name was carved into the wooden sign out front. The Mirror Center, for every child and every mother who ever was one. Underneath, someone had added in smaller script, "No more silence." And so the story continued, not with a scream, not with a courtroom shout, but with whispered truths, shared meals, and the quiet click of a lock turned open for someone new. A place for healing, a place for return, a place where the past wasn't erased, only faced together. It was early morning when the letter arrived. Not an email, not a call, a letter, thick envelope, seal from the state. Clara found it waiting on the kitchen table, beside a cold cup of coffee and the soft hum of a baby monitor, still blinking green. She opened it with hands that didn't yet know whether to tremble or go still. Inside, the verdict. Emmett Caldwell had been sentenced. Multiple counts: fraud, obstruction, child endangerment, tampering with a legal document. The will Adam left had been found, authenticated, and restored. The property was legally Clara's now. But that wasn't the part that made her sit down. It was the line that read, "Incarcerated. 10 years. No parole." She whispered, "It's done." But it didn't feel like relief. It felt like when snow finally stops falling. Not a cheer, just stillness. Grace, standing by the stove in her soft morning robe, poured them both fresh coffee. "It won't undo it," she said. "No," Clara murmured, "but it names it. And that matters." From the hallway came the shuffle of small feet. Mira padded in, dragging her plush rabbit by the ear, hair wild from sleep. She didn't speak, just climbed into Clara's lap, curled up, and laid her cheek over Clara's heartbeat. No one said another word. For now, it was enough. By noon, they were in the garden behind the Mira Center, a half-acre of soil turned and blessed by women who had buried children, dreams, or pieces of themselves. Each rosebush had a name, each lavender row a prayer. Lorraine knelt by a peony, pruning it with gentle care. Her hands shook less these days. "You don't plant unless you believe in spring," she said quietly. Clara didn't answer. She didn't need to. Forgiveness, she was learning, didn't mean denial. It meant not allowing the past to rot what could still bloom. That evening, the women gathered in what had become known as the telling room. Just folding chairs, tea, and time. Margaret, always the first to speak, sat with her back straight and her voice strong. "Truth doesn't crash like thunder. It drips like rain, so slow you barely notice, until suddenly everything is green." Clara followed. "I used to keep a shoebox under my bed," she began. "Hospital bracelets, a knitted sock, letters I never sent. Some nights I'd take it out just to prove to myself it happened, that I hadn't dreamed loving her." There were nods, murmurs. When Lorraine stood, the air tightened. "I said yes to a man who never earned it," she said. "I told myself it was for survival. But I think, truthfully, it was for comfort. Cowardice in the shape of compromise." She looked at Clara directly. "You should hate me." Clara met her eyes. "Hate doesn't grow anything." Lorraine sat back down, eyes full but dry. Days passed. Mira started kindergarten. Clara and Grace stood outside the fence that first day, watching the little girl run in, pigtails bouncing, backpack too big. Just before disappearing through the door, she turned and waved with both hands, like she was waving at the whole sky. "She's going to be okay," Grace whispered. Clara smiled. "She already is." The Mira Center grew. The telling room became a sanctuary. A piano arrived, slightly out of tune. Quilts were draped over window seats. A mural bloomed on the east wall, hands stretching into leaves, reaching toward a sun painted by children who never had one before. One day, a man arrived, nervous, graying at the temples, a daughter in trouble, broken bridges. He didn't know what to say to her anymore. "We don't teach parenting here," Clara told him, handing him tea. "We just hold space for both of you." He stayed 2 hours. He returned the next week. Mira learned to write her name in chalk. She signed every surface, the sidewalk, her notebooks, even the garden stones. "What are you doing?" Clara asked one afternoon, watching her scribble on the porch step. "I'm signing the world," Mira said. "So it remembers me." Clara's voice caught. "It already does." That night, Clara and Grace sat on the back porch. A full moon hung like a borrowed truth above the fields. Inside, Mira slept, her rabbit tucked under her chin. "I thought healing would feel like dancing," Clara said. Grace shook her head. "It's quieter than that. Feels like being able to breathe again." "Do you ever regret it?" Clara asked, taking her in. Grace didn't look away. "Only the time we lost before she was ours." but not a second since. Clara nodded. Sometimes I feel Adam's watching. Not angry, just proud that she made it, that we did. You didn't just make it, Grace said. You remade it. The next morning, Mira added one more leaf to the mural, drawn in her crayon, bold and off-center. Inside the leaf, she scrawled, "Wherever love has been, something always grows." Below it, Clara added one last word, "Begin." And so it ended, and so it began. Not with headlines or handcuffs, not with speeches or applause, but with a mother braiding her daughter's hair, with tea poured for someone who hadn't spoken their story yet, with a door unlocked in quiet defiance of shame. They didn't forget what had happened, they didn't excuse it, but they had reclaimed it. And in a world that had once left a child in a storm and called her disposable, that was everything. From the cracked roots of betrayal, they had built something sacred. And not just for themselves, for every forgotten child, for every silenced woman, for every truth that had waited too long in the dark. They didn't just close a chapter, they turned the page and left the light on. Stories like this don't come to remind us of the cruelty in the world. We already know it exists. They come to remind us of something more fragile, more enduring, the power of truth and the quiet courage it takes to face it. Clara didn't choose to become a symbol. Neither did Grace or Lorraine or little Mira. But sometimes healing begins when one person decides the story will not end in silence. When someone says, "Enough." For me, this story is a reminder that we don't always get to choose what breaks us, but we do get to choose what we build from the pieces. We can choose honesty over comfort, compassion over shame, love even when it's hard. And maybe that's the lesson I carry most, that love, when it's real, doesn't flinch from the truth. It walks with it, it grows from it, and sometimes, even after all that's been lost, it still finds a way to bloom again. If you're watching this, and you've carried something heavy for a long time, maybe a secret, maybe a regret, maybe just the ache of years, please know this. You are not alone. You are still part of the story. You still matter. And to my dear viewers, especially those of you in your golden years, I want to say, I see you. I know how much you've lived through, how many roles you've held, how much love you've given. This space, this story, it's for you too. So tell me, what has life taught you about truth, about healing, or about second chances? Let's keep this circle of telling alive, together. With all my heart, from your storyteller.